Chapter 1. The three goddesses Artemis, Athena, and Hestia had decided to spend the day together with each other in the mortal world. On Hestia's suggestion, they decided to spend the day walking around New York City to see the sights. "I'm so glad you suggested this, Hestia. It's been a while since we have been able to just walk around relaxed like this," a woman with long black hair and piercing gray eyes named Athena said happily. "Yes, I agree with Athena on this, Hestia. Though I think it would be better if there were more wooded areas around," a woman with curly auburn hair and silver eyes named Artemis said, causing the other two to groan good-naturedly at her. "Yes, this was one of my better ideas, wasn't it? You would say that, Artemis. You love the wilderness," a woman with brown hair and flames for eyes named Hestia asked, then stated amusedly. All three then broke out laughing as they continued on their way around the city, with Athena pointing out important buildings or other creations as they went. Later on that day, as they were turning a corner down a less busy street, they came upon the sight of a tall blonde man battling a hellhound with a sword. They were surprised to see him and figured he was a demigod. As the man finished slaying the hellhound, he turned around to see the three women walking towards him. "Hello, young man, I am the goddess Hestia and these two are Artemis and Athena. We were wondering who you were and who your godly parent is?" Hestia asked as they reached him. The man immediately dropped to one knee in front of them. "My name is Minato Namikaze, my ladies. I am sorry to say that I am not a demigod. I'm just a clear-sighted mortal who teaches Kenjutsu in the local area," the man now known as Minato stated as he stood up. "Then how did you get a hold of the weapons you used?" Athena asked inquisitively while still shocked that he was a clear-sighted mortal. "My lady, I gained these blades from a centaur near the edge of town and use them to protect the people around here from the monsters as they cannot see them as I can," Minato stated respectfully. "You must think you're a great man for doing this and can do whatever you want, right?" Artemis asked disdainfully, getting a sigh from the other two goddesses at her tone. "No, my lady, I consider it an honor to protect these people and believe that them being safe is all the reward I need for what I do. That is why I train so much and teach others my art," Minato stated respectfully to her, receiving a shocked look from her as she could tell he wasn't lying to her. "Well, young man, I believe it is time for us to go now. We must get back to our work as goddesses," Hestia said in a kind voice while smiling. "Yes, my lady, I hope to meet you three again in my lifetime. Goodbye," Minato said while bowing to each of them in turn. He then closed his eyes as they flashed away. Back on Olympus, the three goddesses had reappeared in Hestia's temple. "Well, today was fun and meeting that mortal was very insightful. I really liked him," Hestia said happily. "Yes, it was rather refreshing to finally meet a humble and kind man for once," Artemis said thoughtfully. "Yes, I agree with you both on the man. He seemed like he would be good to engage in conversation with," Athena said wistfully. They parted ways a few minutes later after saying their goodbyes and headed back to their duties. Several years later, the three goddesses had decided to go walking around NYC again and hoped to come upon the mortal Minato again to talk with him. "I wonder if we will run into him today like we did then?" Athena asked thoughtfully. "We might, you never know," Hestia said while smiling. "Yes, it would be good to talk with him about the monster population here," Artemis said while looking around the area. The three continued on their way happily. They noticed they were coming upon the area they met the man at before and started looking around for him. Suddenly they heard a pained groan and noticed a trail of blood leading to a side street and followed it cautiously. They gasped when they found Minato sitting against a wall with a hole through his stomach. "Minato, what happened to you?" Hestia asked with a pained look on her face. "My lady, IW was injured by the Minotaur," Minato said through gasps. The three goddesses gasped at that. "I'm afraid your wound is fatal, Minato, and we have no way to heal you." "I am sorry," Athena said sadly after inspecting his wound. "It is alright, my lady, I knew I wasn't going to make it when IW was injured," Minato gasped out. Conserve your strength, Minato, and don't talk too much. I will try to ease the pain for you, Artemis said sadly as she used a rare power she had to dull the pain for him. Thank you, my lady, for that, Minato said as he smiled at them. They sat with him for a while before they noticed he was starting to fade. It is almost time, I can feel it. My only regret is that I never had a family of my own because I dedicated myself to protecting the innocents around me, Minato said sadly before his life left him. Three goddesses looked at him sadly for a moment before looking at each other and nodding. Let's grant his last regret for him, Hestia said sadly as she bent down and collected some of his blood. Yes, I believe he is the one man worthy of this, Artemis said as she cut her arm and let her ichor pool into Hestia's hand along with Minato's. Yes, I agree, he is more deserving than most people of this honor, Athena said as she mimicked Artemis with her own ichor. With my ichor as the final component, I create a child for Minato Namikaze to have a family, Hestia said as she added her own ichor and mixed it all together. A flash happened and then died down, and there in Hestia's arms was a child that was the spitting image of his father, except he had two different colored eyes, one silver and one gray. He also had whisker marks on his cheeks. He is so cute, isn't he, Artemis? Hestia asked while looking at him. Yes, he is very cute. I wonder why he has whisker marks on his cheeks though, Artemis asked with a smile on her face. That is probably something he got from you, Artemis, after all you are the goddess of the hunt and wilderness, Athena stated while tickling the little baby. The other two agreed with Athena's thoughts, and then Artemis did something and Minato's body disappeared. What should we name him? Artemis asked thoughtfully. How about Naruto Namikaze in honor of his father? Hestia said happily. I agree, that is a splendid name, Hestia, Athena said happily. The three began to walk around happily while talking and cooing at Naruto. As it got later, they began to discuss on what to do with him since they couldn't raise him themselves as it was against the God's laws. Where will we take him, Hestia? Minato had no family to take him in, Artemis asked her. We will have to take him to an orphanage and leave him there, Hestia said sadly. I know just the place, it's ran by a daughter of Demeter. So we can show ourselves to her and make sure he is well taken care of, Athena said happily. The others smiled at this news and nodded as they flashed to the place. They reappeared on a long dirt road surrounded by woods on the outskirts of Long Island. I already like this place, it's secluded and surrounded by woods, Artemis said happily as they began walking down the road. Yes, I knew you would, Artemis. It's an orphanage specifically made for demigod children. It even has a shield around it to keep out monsters, Athena explained to them. So who is this daughter of Demeter that runs this place, Athena? Hestia asked expectantly. Oh, her name is Stephanie Ramirez. She wanted to give demigod children who hadn't come of age yet and had no family left a place to live till she could take them to camp, Athena explained happily as they turned a corner in the road and saw the orphanage in the distance. Well, there it is, let's hurry so we can talk to her before it gets too late, Hestia said as they sped up to get there quickly. As they arrived at the door, a tall woman with long brown hair and kind green eyes walked out to meet them. When she realized who they were, she bowed her head to them in respect. How may I help you, my ladies? She asked in a soft voice. Stephanie, we would like you to take in our child here till he is of age to go to Camp Half-Blood, Athena answered in an equally soft voice. I would be honored to, my ladies, Stephanie said as she looked towards Naruto, who was asleep in Hestia's arms. Thank you, Stephanie, for doing this for us, Hestia said in a kind voice. Stephanie bowed her head to her with a smile on her face. May we come in for a moment? We wish to leave a few things with you for him, Artemis asked her nicely. Yes, please come on in, my ladies, Stephanie said as she held the door open for them. She then led them up a set of stairs and to her office on the second floor. Now may I see what you have left for him? Stephanie asked softly. Artemis nodded her head and pulled out a necklace with a pendant of a moon surrounded by a bow on it and handed it to her. This is a special necklace that will turn into a bow for him when he pulls on the bow pendant. Artemis explained as Stephanie nodded and placed it in a drawer on her desk. Artemis then snapped her hand and a fox appeared and looked at her. I would also like to leave Kurama here with Naruto as protection for him. He is an enchanted fox, she said as Stephanie nodded as the fox moved to her side. Athena then stepped forward and snapped her fingers. When the flash died down, a red socks hat and a thick book on mythology with a note appeared on Stephanie's desk. I am leaving Naruto one of my invisibility caps that will work by a mental command. And one of my personal books on mythology with a note for him. Athena said as Stephanie placed them in her desk with a nod. Hestia then handed Naruto over to Artemis and pulled out a Zippo and handed it to Stephanie. That is a 2-in-1 gift. It will work like a regular lighter to always give him a flame to use his powers with. Also when he pushes in on the engraving of a sword while thinking about a sword, it will turn into a katana for him. Hestia said as she watched Stephanie call out the katana form of the sword. The katana had a celestial bronze blade with a plain silver rectangular guard and black wrappings on the handle. Stephanie nodded as the katana turned back into the Zippo and she placed it back into her desk. I will make sure he receives them when he is old enough, my ladies. Stephanie said as she bowed her head to them. Thank you, Stephanie. Hestia said happily. We must go now before the other gods start wondering where we are. Athena said unhappily as she kissed Naruto on the head. Please take good care of him for us, Stephanie. Artemis said as she handed him to Stephanie after she and Hestia had kissed him on the head as well. I will, my ladies, to the best of my abilities. Stephanie said. Thank you, we also leave $10,000 to help take care of him. They said together as they flashed away back to Olympus. After they were gone, Stephanie looked down at Naruto and smiled. He is going to be a strong demigod, she thought as she left her office and headed to the nursery just down the hall. When she arrived, she placed Naruto into one of the cribs and placed Kurama into the crib beside him. 6 years later. A spiky blonde-haired boy could be seen out in the woods around the orphanage leaning against a tree reading a thick book on mythology which he loved to learn about. He was a special boy with heterochromatic eyes, one was silver and the other was gray. He had whisker marks on his cheeks. He was wearing a necklace around his neck with a pendant of a moon surrounded by bow. He had on an orange shirt and green camouflage pants and combat boots on his feet. He also had a red socks hat on his head and he was flicking a Zippo open and closed absent-mindedly in his left hand. Suddenly he looked up and to his left as he heard a voice calling out his name. He closed his book with a groan and got up and headed in the direction of the voice to see Stephanie waiting for him at the edge of the woods. Naruto, where have you been? You were supposed to be back 30 minutes ago. Stephanie asked in a sharp tone as she saw him walking towards her. Sorry, I lost track of time while reading my book you gave me from my mom. Naruto said sheepishly while rubbing the back of his head. Stephanie's look softened at that as she shook her head exasperatedly. Naruto, you need to start being more aware when you're doing things, she said as she grabbed his hand and led him back towards the orphanage. I know and I'm sorry, I'll try to fix that, Naruto said as he looked ahead towards the entrance of the orphanage. Well, come on Naruto, we need to get you sorted for a new school since you got kicked out of the last one, Stephanie said in a soft tone as she knew Naruto hated not being able to stay in one school for longer than a year. Yeah, I know, I hate that I got kicked out of my last one, Naruto said sadly as he looked down. Till he was tackled by a orange blur causing him to cry out in shock and Stephanie to laugh out loud. When Naruto got over his shock and had pushed what had tackled him off of him, he had looked to see it was Kurama and smiled. Thanks buddy, I needed that, Naruto said as he scratched Kurama behind his ear. Kurama yipped at Naruto and snuggled into his hand more. Slowly Naruto got up while holding Kurama, and he and Stephanie made their way inside and up to her office. They spent a few hours there finding a school that would take Naruto as a student. Finally they found one called Yansei Academy that had agreed to take Naruto as a student. They agreed it would be best for him as it was a boarding school and Naruto could stay there during the school year and come back during the summer. Well, now that we have found a school for you Naruto, we can take it easy for now, Stephanie said as she smiled at him. Do you think they will let me continue my Kenjutsu training there as my school for it is close by? Naruto asked hopefully. I don't see why not Naruto, but you will have to talk to them about it and set something up, Stephanie said while smiling at him. Naruto had nodded at that, then asked if he could go back outside for a while. Stephanie had sighed then and allowed him to go back outside and play. Naruto had hopped up at that and grabbed Kurama and made a beeline for the front door. Once he was outside he let Kurama jump to the ground and they took off towards the woods again. So what do you think of my new school Kurama? Naruto asked the fox once they were a good ways in. As long as they don't mind me being there I think it will be a good place for you, Kurama said back in a series of yips. Yeah, I guess you're right, I just hope nothing too bad happens while we're there, Naruto said, receiving a nod of agreement from the fox. After that they spent a good portion of the day just hanging out in the woods with Naruto practicing his Kenjutsu and archery skills. That night Naruto stayed up to stare at the full moon, which always had the effect of calming him down and helping him clear his thoughts so he could think more clearly. During these times Naruto would usually spend it thinking about his parents, his mom or moms, if he could believe some of the stuff Stephanie would tell him in particular, and wonder who they were and where they were. He would also think about his many talents and gifts he had during this time as well, like his abilities in archery and Kenjutsu, and whether his parents had these abilities as well. A gift he had that he always wondered about was his photographic memory and how it helped him in his schooling even though he had ADHD and dyslexia. After a few hours of these thoughts Naruto finally let himself drift off to sleep while still watching the full moon. 6 years later. Naruto had changed a lot during this time. He had garnered a reputation at Yansei as one of the silent bad boys who was also the smartest in his grade. He had also made 2 friends in Percy Jackson and Grover Underwood. Many people were skeptical about their friendship as they were very different in a lot of ways, but just shrugged it off. Currently Naruto was in his room preparing for the day as they had a field trip for their Latin class that day. Naruto had decided to dress in his black shirt that had a design of an owl with a moon in the background flying over a sea of flames on the front. He also wore his customary camouflage pants and black combat boots. Around his neck he wore his moon and bow pendant, and on his head his Red Sox hat. As he was leaving his room to head to his Latin classroom he grabbed his Zippo off his dresser and placed it in his pocket. As he was walking he thought back to the summer before where Stephanie had finally revealed the truth to him about his mothers being Olympian goddesses. He had been skeptical at first until Stephanie showed him irrefutable proof of the gods being real by using her powers and explaining that she was a daughter of Demeter. After he had learned that he had doubled his studies into Greek mythology and his weapons practices. He had also learned of the abilities of his hat, pendant, and Zippo at that time then too. He had also spent most of that summer trying to figure out who his mothers were among the goddesses. But when he couldn't, Stephanie had just told him to wait and he would find out when he arrived at Camp Half-Blood and they claimed him. Naruto came out of his thoughts as he came to his Latin classroom's door. He took a deep breath to calm himself and entered the room. When he looked around he saw most of his classmates already there, including Percy and Grover. He could also see Mr. Brunner at the front of the class in his wheelchair and nodded to him as he walked past him to where Percy and Grover were at. A few minutes later and the door opened to allow Mrs. Dodds into the room. Naruto scowled at her as she was one of his most hated teachers and he knew that she was actually a fury. He just didn't know why she was here. He saw Mr. Brunner stiffen a little in his chair at her entrance but then relax. as she nodded to him, signaling that the bus was ready for them. "Well class, it's time for us to head out. Please form a line and follow Mrs. Dodds to where the bus is," Mr. Brunner said in his usual kind voice. A few minutes later, Naruto was on the bus in a seat across from Grover and Percy, watching as Percy got mad at Nancy Bobofit, who was throwing pieces of her sandwich at Grover and laughing as it got stuck in his hair. He finally got tired of it when he saw Percy about to get himself in trouble while Grover was trying to stop him. "Nancy, if you don't stop, you'll be next on my list," Naruto said in an innocent tone, causing Nancy to freeze and start sweating. She could remember the last person who had been on his list and didn't want to be added to it. "Okay, I'll stop, but why do you keep hanging around them? They're losers," Nancy asked hesitantly. "Because they're better company than you are, Nancy," Naruto answered as he turned away from her. They had been at the museum for a while now, and Naruto and his two friends were at the back of the group while commenting on how some of the things would be fun to do, like ridding the chariots. When Mr. Brunner had led the group up to a tall stone column that he called a stele, a grave marker for a girl about their age, they had suddenly found themselves at the front of the group and had been trying to pay close attention to Mr. Brunner, but a group of people behind them were talking too loud for them to hear him properly. "Can you guys shut up?" Percy finally said angrily. "Mr. Jackson, do you have something you would like to say?" Mr. Brunner asked, clapping his hand together. "No sir," Percy mumbled out while the others snickered at him until they saw Naruto giving them the evil eye. "Well then, perhaps you could tell me what is happening in the picture," Mr. Brunner said, motioning to a picture on the stele that showed a man with a child in his hand and his mouth wide open. "Well, that's Cronus eating his kids," Percy said as he gained some confidence after recognizing the pictures. "Yes, and he did this because?" Mr. Brunner asked, obviously not satisfied. "Well," Percy began, not sure of the reason. "He was the king of the Titans and he didn't trust his kids, the gods. So he ate them, but his wife Rhea hid baby Zeus, and gave him a rock to eat instead. Then when Zeus was older, he tricked his father into barfing up his brothers and sisters, then there was a war and the gods won," Naruto supplied for Percy, who smiled, thanking Naruto. Some of the girls in the class went ew when the comment about barfing was mentioned. "That is correct," Mr. Brunner said. "Then the world became ruled by the 12 Olympian gods, with the strongest being Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades," he added as he pointed out 3 small figures on the stele. "Ever since they overthrew their father, they have been rivals ever since," Mr. Brunner added after a few minutes of silence. "On many occasions the gods came down to earth, and how should I put this?" Mr. Brunner said in thought before Naruto spoke up. "They hooked up because they couldn't keep it in their pants," he said, causing everyone to laugh, including Mrs. Dodds and Mr. Brunner. "That is correct, Mr. Namikaze. Can you tell me the correct terms for these children?" Mr. Brunner asked him. "They were called demigods, I believe, part mortal, part god," Naruto said, receiving a nod from Mr. Brunner. "Could you name me some of these demigods?" Mr. Brunner asked, directing the question towards Naruto. "Let's see, there was Hercules and Perseus, they were sons of Zeus. Then there was Theseus, and he was a son of Poseidon," Naruto said in answer, receiving a nod from Mr. Brunner. "That is correct. Very good, Mr. Namikaze. It's good to see that you pay attention in class," Mr. Brunner said with a small smile on his face. However, they heard snickers coming from the group behind them and Nancy Bobofit saying, "Like we're going to use this in real life. Like it's going to say on our job applications, please explain why Cronus ate his kids or name a demigod." She continued to snicker for a few minutes longer after saying that. "And why Mr. Jackson?" Mr. Brunner asked, to paraphrase Mrs. Bobofit's excellent question, "does this matter in real life?" Percy thought about the question for a moment. "I'm sorry sir, but I really don't know," Percy finally said. "And how about you, Mr. Namikaze?" he asked Naruto. Well sir, there are many ways this could matter in real life. You could get a job like an architect or mythologist where this pertains to your field of study. Or there are some other ways, but most of them would cause people here to call me crazy. Naruto answered, causing Mr. Brunner and Mrs. Dodds to narrow their eyes at him for a moment. I see. Mr. Brunner said after a moment. Well, half credit to you both. On that note, it's time for lunch. Mrs. Dodds, would you lead us back outside? Mr. Brunner said, then asked. She nodded, then led the students back down the hallway. It wasn't till a few minutes later that Naruto realized that Percy wasn't with him and looked around, seeing him having a conversation with Mr. Brunner. He shrugged, realizing it was none of his business, and started to look around to see if there was anything he hadn't seen yet. When they were near the end of the hallway, Naruto saw an area off to the side that had statues of the goddesses with the 3 virgin goddesses in the center. He approached their statues, feeling drawn to them. Interesting, aren't they? He heard a voice say, and turned around to see Mr. Brunner at the entrance to the area. Yes, they are. I don't know why, but I feel drawn to them, Naruto said as he turned back around to look at the statues again. Naruto, I was wondering if you could tell me what the rest of your answer to my question would have been, Mr. Brunner asked while staring at the statues as well. I guess I could, sir. You see, this would also matter in real life if you were like me, and I'm starting to believe Percy is as well. And have gods or goddesses as parents, Naruto answered, causing Mr. Brunner's eyes to widen. How do you know? Mr. Brunner asked. Do you know that orphanage that is run by Stephanie Ramirez? Naruto asked, receiving a nod from Mr. Brunner. Well, I was raised there by her, Naruto explained, getting a look of understanding from Mr. Brunner. Ah, and she must have explained about the gods to you last summer in preparation of you going to Camp Half-Blood this summer, Mr. Brunner reasoned aloud. That's right, but I still don't know who my godly parents are. All I know is that they are 3 of the goddesses, Naruto said, getting a surprised look from Mr. Brunner. I see, said Mr. Brunner with a contemplative look on his face. Well, I'm going to go back out to eat lunch, Mr. Brunner, Naruto said as he left the area after casting one last look at the 3 goddesses' statues. Mr. Brunner sat there for a moment longer looking at the 3 goddesses' statues while thinking, I wonder if it would explain his eyes and why he likes flames. After a few more minutes he shrugged and headed outside after Naruto. The class had commandeered the museum steps and the fountain wall for seats to eat their lunch. Up in the sky it looked like a big storm was brewing as some huge dark clouds were moving in over the city. Naruto remembered seeing on the news lately that floods, hurricanes, and storms were forming all over the world, leaving scientists baffled about the weather. Then there were the guys he saw more often with signs saying, "The end is near." Naruto sat on the edge of the fountain near Percy and Grover as they ate their lunch and chatted about different things. You get detention again? Grover asked, looking at Percy. Nah, not from Brunner. I just wish he would lay off me sometimes. I mean, I'm not a genius, Percy said, looking unhappily at his sandwich. Well, we already knew that, Percy, Naruto said, getting a punch in the arm from Percy. Okay. Can I have your apple? Grover said, shrugging, getting a chuckle out of Naruto as Percy handed over his apple. Naruto looked out at his class to see some of the boys pelting birds with small rocks. I swear boys are stupid sometimes, Naruto mumbled, then stopped as he realized what he just said. Why did I just say that? He thought to himself. The 3 began to chat about what they might do over the summer, when Naruto noticed Nancy and her goons approaching their location. He saw her pretend to trip and dump her lunch all over Grover. Oops, she said, grinning while her friends snickered at Grover. Percy jumped up angry, but Naruto stopped him while staring at Nancy with narrowed eyes. You just made my list, Boba Fett, be prepared, Naruto said icily, causing Nancy and her friends to pale and scamper away to another side of the fountain. Grover looked relieved, but Percy still looked angry and kept his eyes on Nancy. That's when something weird and unexplained happened. Nancy suddenly fell into the fountain, making a loud and audible splash, making everyone look at her, and caused Mrs. Dodds to come over. "Mrs. Dodds, Percy and Naruto just pushed me," Nancy cried out, but neither Naruto or Percy were paying attention. Percy was trying to figure out what happened, and Naruto had narrowed his eyes as he had seen the tentacle of water pull Nancy into the water. It had confirmed his suspicions on Percy being a demigod. He just didn't know who his parent was. "Mr. Jackson, Mr. Namikaze, come with me now," Mrs. Dodds said after she had made sure Nancy was all right. "Wait, it was me, I pushed her," Grover said suddenly while trying to stand up without his crutches. Mrs. Dodds wasn't buying it and led Naruto and Percy back into the museum. "Damn it," Grover mumbled to himself as he tried to get Mr. Brunner's attention. Naruto and Percy were following Mrs. Dodds deeper into the museum and noticed that there were no people around the area. Naruto narrowed his eyes and figured that Mrs. Dodds was finally making her move. But he couldn't figure out what her motivation was. They soon arrived in an area of the museum with a statue of Hades at the back of the room. Mrs. Dodds turned around to them once they were in the room and focused on Percy. "Now honey, did you really think we didn't know it was you?" Mrs. Dodds asked, focusing on Percy, causing Naruto to narrow his eyes at her. "I'm sorry," Percy said as the first thing to come to mind. "Now then, confess and we may take it easy on you," she said, causing Percy and Naruto to grow confused. "What are you talking about?" Naruto asked her. "Ah yes, Mr. Namikaze, I figured you might have something to do with this as well, so tell your friend to hand it over or else," Mrs. Dodds said, confusing them more. "Just what am I supposed to have?" Percy asked her, causing her to get mad. "Stop acting like you don't know what I'm talking about, honeys," Mrs. Dodds said angrily. "But we don't," Percy began before Mrs. Dodds interrupted him. "That's it, I'm going to kill you and take it from you," Mrs. Dodds said as she began to transform into a monster with beady black eyes, gray skin, and leathery black wings. Naruto pulled on his necklace, transforming it into his bow, as Percy looked at her in shock. "Now tell me where the lightning bolt is," Mrs. Dodds shouted as she took to the air to dodge a flaming arrow from Naruto. Before anything else could happen, the boys heard a shout. Percy turned around. They turned around to see Mr. Brunner throwing something towards Percy from the entrance. Percy caught it and looked to see it was a pen. "Uncap it, Percy," Mr. Brunner said urgently. Percy did, and the pen suddenly transformed into a sword. "Wow," Percy said. "Percy, now isn't the time, focus on this thing," Naruto said, causing Percy to nod and take a swing at her with the sword right as Naruto shot an arrow at her. Both connected at the same time, causing Mrs. Dodds to let out a scream and turn into gold dust. Percy was shocked and turned to Naruto to see him just standing there with no weapon. "What was that just now?" Percy asked as he looked at the pen in his head that had just been a sword. "I don't know, Percy, let's get out of here," Naruto said, convincingly enough to get a nod from Percy. As they reached the exit of the museum, they were approached by Nancy. "Where have you idiots been? Mrs. Kerr is about to take us back into the museum," she said, sneering at them. "Who the hell is Mrs. Kerr?" Percy asked while Naruto narrowed his eyes at the name. But all they got from her was her rolling her eyes and walking away, muttering idiots. They both also noticed her clothes were now completely dry instead of wet. They then walked up to Grover and asked him the same thing, and he gave the same answer but was stuttering slightly, so they knew he was lying. So they focused their attention on Mr. Brunner instead. Mr. Brunner looked up a little distracted. "Ah, that would be my pen. Please remember to bring your own writing utensil in the future, Mr. Jackson," he said. Okay," Percy said, looking confused as he handed over the pen to Mr. Brunner, who put it into his front pocket. Sir, where is Mrs. Dodds? Percy asked. Who? Mr. Brunner asked him, confused. The other chaperone. Mrs. Dodds, the pre-algebra teacher. Percy asked as Naruto looked Mr. Brunner in the eye and winked and received a slight nod back. Mr. Brunner let a frown appear on his face, and sat forward, slightly concerned. Percy, Naruto, there is no Mrs. Dodds on this trip. As far as I know, there has never been a Mrs. Dodds at Yancey Academy. Are you both feeling all right? Mr. Brunner said in confusion. Say what? Percy asked, not believing what he was hearing. You boys may have just got Mrs. Kerr's name mixed up with someone else, perhaps a past teacher at an old school. Don't worry about it, boys. Mr. Brunner said before wheeling off. Come, it's time to head back into the museum, boys. As Mr. Brunner wheeled off, Percy looked at Naruto with a dumbfounded look on his face. With only one thing coming to mind to describe what just happened. What the hell, he said, causing Naruto to crack up laughing.